Do not call them peaceful. They are resting. Ambassador Dara of the Vreth Collective had been assigned to the Human Diplomatic Corps Observation Program because she was, by any assessment, the best xenocultural analyst in the Vreth Diplomatic Service. She had spent 40 years studying galactic diplomatic traditions. She had observed 11 different species negotiating frameworks. She had written the Vreth Standard Guide to Cross-Species Diplomatic Engagement. She would later say, completely unprepared. Not because the humans were frightening. She had expected, after the Battle of Sol and the Deathworld classification and the 47-word message that had shaken 17 fleet commanders, to find something formidable, something hard-edged, something that matched the reputation. Instead, she found a corridor. The formal session had not yet begun. The human delegation, 7 diplomats, 3 legal advisors, and 1 junior clerk named Tobias Vance, who appeared to have brought his own annotated copy of the Galactic Charter, had arrived an hour early. They were standing in the corridor outside the main chamber, drinking coffee from containers they had apparently brought themselves, and talking. Not preparing. Not reviewing briefs. Talking. Dara's observer protocol required her to document everything. She opened her recorder. The lead diplomat, a woman named Counselor Amara Obi, was talking with 2 of her colleagues about a land rights dispute she'd read about in passing, between the Keth and the Meridian, nothing to do with today's session, not on any agenda. She was talking about it the way you might talk about a puzzle you'd found interesting. The core issue isn't the treaty language, she was saying. The treaty language is fine. The issue is that neither party has a framework for shared stewardship. They're both thinking ownership. If you reframe as stewardship, joint custodianship with defined responsibilities rather than competing claims, the territorial dispute resolves itself. Her colleague had said, "Is that our problem to solve?" Amara had looked briefly surprised by the question. "It's an interesting problem," she said. "We're here anyway." This, Dara wrote in her first observation note, may be the key behavioral indicator I need to watch. The formal session went well. The humans were prepared, extraordinarily prepared, with exactly the thoroughness that the Council had come to expect from the species that had showed up to its accession negotiations with 11,000 years of precedent annotated in the margins. They were also, Dara noted, pleasant, unfailingly, not diplomatically pleasant, not the professional warmth of trained negotiators maintaining cordial relations. Genuinely pleasant, curious about the people across the table, interested in them as individuals. This was disconcerting. Dara had spent 40 years in galactic diplomacy. She was accustomed to the professional friendliness of cross-species negotiation, a performance of goodwill designed to maintain productive working relationships. She was not accustomed to diplomats who seemed to actually want to know things about their counterparts. Counselor Obi spent 15 minutes of a scheduled break asking the Keth delegate about his species' concept of seasonal governance, having apparently read a footnote about it in a xenocultural brief. The delegate, who had expected the break to be a tactical pause for strategy review, had found himself explaining a 300-year-old Keth governmental tradition to a human who was taking notes. Dara wrote, "They treat every interaction as a learning opportunity. This is not a tactic. It appears to be a reflex." After the session, over dinner, humans, she noted, appear to believe that meals were a legitimate continuation of the working day. She witnessed the first of the 12 incidents she would eventually document in her report. The Meridian Keth land rights dispute she had overheard Amara discussing in the corridor, resolved, not in a formal session, not by designated mediators. Over dinner, between the soup course and the main, Amara had quietly steered a conversation between the Keth and Meridian delegates toward the stewardship framework she'd been thinking about. By the time the main course arrived, both parties had agreed to request a mediation session structured around the concept. Dara sat very still for a moment after she noted this. She had been briefed that the Meridian Keth dispute had been ongoing for 40 years. It had failed 6 formal mediation attempts. It had apparently needed someone who found it interesting. 3 weeks into the observation period, Dara had filled 400 pages of documentation and was beginning to understand that she had not been assigned to watch diplomats. She had been assigned to watch something that didn't have a name yet. The hallway diplomacy was the first thing she documented formally. Humans, she observed, resolve their most important business not in the formal sessions, but between them, in corridors, over meals, in the margins of every official interaction. The formal session was where agreements were ratified. The actual work happened in what she initially classified as informal social time, before she realized that for humans, there was no such thing as social time that wasn't also working time. They could not be in the presence of a problem without attempting to solve it. It appeared to be a physical impossibility. Dara began, in her third week, to deliberately expose them to problems she had been carrying unsolved from her own docket, just to watch what happened. It worked every time. The second pattern was patience. Not passive patience, not waiting. The specific human patience as strategy she had first noted in Yara Solis's 47 words. She observed it now in a diplomatic context. The deliberate choice to lose a small point in order to position for a larger one, executed so smoothly that the opposing party didn't realize concession had been made until 3 sessions later. Counselor Obi was the master of this. Dara watched her yield 3 minor procedural arguments in the first week of a session, and then, in week 4, extract a major substantive concession from a party that had been feeling that negotiations were going rather well for them. Dara reviewed her notes and realized she hadn't seen it happening in real time. The yield and extract cycle was so unhurried, so seemingly accidental, that she documented both halves without connecting them. She wrote, "Human patience is not passive. It is a weapon deployed with surgical precision. Do not mistake the absence of urgency for the absence of strategy." The third pattern was the one that disturbed her most. They kept track of everything, not in a threatening way, not in the way of adversaries cataloging grievances, in the way of scholars maintaining meticulous records, because information might later prove relevant. Every conversation, every exchange, every informal interaction, they remembered. The junior clerk, Tobias Vance, had produced, in week 2, an annotated cross-reference of the past 6 months of negotiation sessions that documented 17 interconnected threads across 12 separate delegations, none of which had been formally identified as connected. He'd mentioned it casually over coffee, as though it were an interesting thing he'd noticed rather than the most comprehensive diplomatic intelligence summary Dara had seen in 40 years. "Do you always do this?" she'd asked. He'd looked genuinely puzzled. "Do what?" In week 10, Dara's observer protocol was tested in a way she had not anticipated. The Heron-Velith trade negotiation, which had been proceeding for 3 months, was collapsing. Not dramatically, not with visible breakdown, the kind of thing that could be managed. It was collapsing quietly, through a series of small procedural misunderstandings that had accumulated into an impasse neither party knew how to leave. Dara had been assigned to observe, not to intervene. The observer protocol was explicit. She was documentation, not participation. She sat in her observer seat and watched the negotiation approach the edge. Counselor Obi, who was present as part of the human delegation, but whose species was not party to the Heron-Velith negotiation, was in the adjacent seat, not Dara's assigned seat. She had moved there at the start of the session, which Dara had noted as unusual. 30 minutes in, as the negotiation was visibly stalling, Obi leaned toward the Heron delegate and said something quietly. Not on the record, not through official channels. Something brief. The Heron delegate looked at the table, then, slowly, said something back to the Velith side. Not the position she'd been defending for 3 months. A different framing. Shared stewardship, with defined responsibilities rather than competing claims. The Velith delegate paused, then said, "We would want this formalized properly." "Of course," the Heron delegate said. The session did not collapse. It ended, 2 hours later, with a framework agreement and a request for a formal ratification session. Dara wrote for an hour after the session ended. Then she made a decision she had not planned to make. She submitted a protocol exception request. Then she went and found Obi in the corridor. She asked about the technique. Obi's response was characteristically direct. "I didn't have a technique," she said. "I just recognized the pattern." The Heron delegate had been defending a territorial position for 3 months that I don't think she actually wanted. She'd inherited it from the previous delegation. I just gave her a different way to frame the same underlying interest without losing face. How did you know that? I read the previous session transcripts. 3 months of them. She paused. Also, I asked her last week what she actually wanted for her community if the treaty worked. Off the record, she told me. A slight shrug. People generally tell you what they want if you ask sincerely. Dara sat with this. In 40 years of galactic diplomacy, she had been trained to assume that what people said was a strategic position, not an honest expression of interest. She had been trained to analyze, to probe for leverage points, to understand what the opposing party was hiding behind their stated position. She had not, in 40 years, considered simply asking. "We don't do that," she said. "I know," Obi said. She said it without judgment, just as a fact. "We probably do it too much. There are situations where showing your interests clearly is a disadvantage." She paused. "But when trust exists, even provisional trust, even just enough trust to have a conversation, the direct question resolves things faster than any other method." She looked at Dara steadily. "We've been talking for 10 weeks. I trust you enough to tell you things directly. I assumed you felt the same." Dara wrote, "That evening, she assumed I felt the same. It had not occurred to her to verify this assumption before acting on it. This is either extraordinary recklessness or the most functional negotiating practice I have ever encountered, and I cannot yet determine which." Her 400-page report took 3 weeks to write. The executive summary took 4 days. She had drafted it 7 times. The first 6 drafts had been analytical, thorough, rigorous, formatted to galactic diplomatic standard. They had been accurate. They had been, she realized on the 7th draft, fundamentally wrong. Not in their facts, but in their framing. She had spent 6 months observing humans and written 6 drafts of a report that analyzed them from outside. She needed to write from inside what she'd seen. The 7th draft opened. Asterisk, do not call them peaceful. They are resting. Asterisk. She let the line stand. Then she wrote 400 pages of what it meant. The report documented everything. The hallway diplomacy, the patience as weapon, the continuous documentation, the sincere direct question used as a primary tool. It documented all 12 incidents in which human diplomats had solved problems outside their assigned brief simply because the problems were present and the humans found them interesting. It documented the Heron-Velith negotiation and her own violation of observer protocol. She wrote about that last one carefully. She had gone outside her mandate. She had used a technique she'd learned from a human diplomat in a context where her own species' protocol was explicit that she should only observe. The outcome had been positive. The protocol violation had been, she believed, the right call. She wrote, Asterisk, I'm not certain this is a lesson I should have learned. I am certain I am better at my work for having learned it. Asterisk. Her recommendation was the line that circulated furthest. Asterisk. Do not attempt to outmaneuver them. Learn from them. This is not weakness. This is the most tactically sound position available to us. Asterisk. And then, in a footnote, she almost cut. Asterisk. I am submitting a transfer request to the Xenocultural Exchange Program. I am aware this falls outside standard protocol. I have reviewed the relevant regulations, found a clause that permits it, and attached the documentation. I learned this from watching Tobias Vance. Asterisk. Asterisk, I would like 1 more year. Asterisk. The council received the report, debated her recommendation for 6 weeks, and eventually agreed to formalize the Xenocultural Exchange Program. In those 6 weeks, the human delegation had, entirely by accident, while waiting for the meeting to be scheduled, resolved 2 outstanding council administrative disputes that had been pending for 8 years. No one was surprised. Dara had predicted it in page 312 of her report. Asterisk. They cannot be in the presence of a problem without attempting to address it. This is not ambition. It is not aggression. It is simply what they do when they are present and paying attention. Which is always. Asterisk.